ICH is obviously intangible cultural heritage. EDI is equity, diversity and inclusion. And the red list is when I'll be referring to the biennial projects from Heritage Crafts, the red list of endangered crafts. So the GRTSB Craft Makers Survey round 1 took place between December 2022 and June 2023, and it actually is open until the end of June, so June the 30th, so it's still open. As a communities facing independent survey with 2 outcome objectives. The first was to support the 2023 Heritage Crafts Red List of Endangered Crafts. And this survey provided real-time, let's see if I can click through, I don't know, yeah, there we go. This survey provided real-time research, data, interviews and imagery to support 3 new entries onto the red list, which are canal arts, fairground arts and Vardo making, respectively, plus additional notes to include traveller context into existing listings, including horn and antler working, tinsmithing, and I believe floristry is an ongoing amended edition. And then secondly, as a standalone body of independent research, for the purposes of GRTSB EDI advocacy, awareness, representation, and to get a real-time picture of the landscape of GRTSB crafts practices, including traditional heritage and contemporary iterations of crafts practice within GRTSB communities and are identifiable as such. So I'll just talk a little bit about the structure of the report, and I'll begin with the methodology. So really, to begin with the methodology, we need to talk about the definition of crafts in round 1 in this survey. So working with the Heritage Crafts framework for the red list, we're now including cultural practices that pertain, or cultural crafts practices that pertain to ethnicity or location. And this was a new consideration on top of the existing criteria of skill-based crafts identification. And this is an inclusive expansion of the red list criteria, and it has provided a real deepening of the potential for the red list as a safeguarding mechanism and documentation that really supports the UNESCO definitions of ICH and meets the international best practice of EDI within cultural and heritage spaces. Just going to click through and give you another picture. There we go. So really, this all comes together to help prevent craft extinction, loss of master and apprentice lineages, and preventing loss of workshops and tools and skills, because these are really valuable resources that once they're gone, through informal training, you can't get that back. And it promotes intergenerational learning and informal or traditional models of education, something the GRTSB communities do really well. And this is a layer to the sort of informal apprenticeship model, which may present itself sort of non-academically, but it is really valuable. I'm just going to take a sip. So the survey approach really had to come from a place of cultural awareness and being practical about that. So GRTSB communities are generally closed communities, and we can talk about why that is in discussion after, but it is enough to say that trust and safety are paramount when supporting marginalised and racialised communities. When Heritage Crafts approached me as an EDI subcommittee member to support the new entries on the red list, the first thing was to speak with GRTSB crafts practitioners and to get their input. But how? How do you do that? How do we do that? And so it's really important to note that colonially and anthropologically, marginalised communities don't want to feel exploited, othered, or objectified in research. And at the same time, there is a real need to share artistry and pride in craft. If craft is a language, then maybe that's where we will be best understood. So this idea of building a bridge of trust between the organisation and the community, and that the community really advocates and represents itself, is really where this kind of level of primary research is going and should be going. So I made the point that the research would need to be community facing and contain only community voices. That is, people who identify culturally and ethnically as belonging to the GRTSB communities. Therefore, any data and research would be 100% self-representational. And of course, Heritage Crafts supported this approach. And they were really great at trusting me with that approach. And I also needed to respect the anonymity of anybody that would provide information. And so if anybody who participated in the survey wanted to be contacted in a sort of second wave contact after the survey was filled in, to see if they would be happy to be contacted, named potentially, photographed potentially. All of these are layers to building trust, but also at every point, the participant has the opportunity to say, no, that's not safe for me, or that's not right for me, whatever, you know, and that has to be respected. So I knew going into this research that people would want anonymity, and I had to honor that and wanted to honor that. So that was implicit from the very beginning, that there was no pressure to be public, but that their information and their wisdom was really important. So to get that on the record whilst respecting anonymity was key. Also, the images that you're seeing in my slides are provided by people who contributed to the report, who were happy to provide. And so the bank of images are really precious as well, because these are people's personal archive of photographs that maybe haven't been seen before. So I designed an online survey to meet the needs of the Red List research criteria, and also my own additional criteria for this wider report, because this was a real moment in time to get as much information as possible. So the report and the Red List complement each other and feed into each other. Survey distribution was done via my online blog, social media sharing, Travelers Times magazine online call out, direct to the community, and direct networking through my colleagues, family and friends within the communities. And that worked really well. There also had to be an acknowledgement of an overview of how the data was collected in the research approach from the beginning, because our elders in the GRTSB communities maybe not be literate, technology literate. They, for trust and the cultural interface, prefer phone calls, face-to-face conversations, meetings. All this is completely valid and has to be built into the research model. So I collected, as well as the survey online, I did telephone interviews where I asked the survey questions in a less formal manner. It was a lot of conversations. Some people direct messaged me, some people left me voice notes. Some people emailed me. Some of the elders needed their children or grandchildren to help them with the survey. So there was a multi-layered approach that was very intergenerationally sensitive and also culturally sensitive, where, you know, the respect there of, I'm not gathering information and extracting information. I'm actually in a relationship, and we're building a story and a narrative and a position of self-representation. All of that work goes a really long way into getting quality data with a legacy, with longevity, and also creating new contacts, which you would hope would be the result of something that was community facing. So in the responses, in the report that I'm writing, there will be the answers to the questions directly with initial reflections and a summary. Let me just change this image for you. And then I'll be doing a deeper analysis of the patterns and themes within the responses, and any correlations that can be extrapolated from the data that will be helpful to support crafts representation in these communities. And then at the back of that, there will be a full summary, an appendix of all the interview transcripts from everyone I spoke to who was happy for me to transcribe their voices. And then there'll be an appendix of images shared that were contributed by the survey participants who were happy to have these images shared. This was going to be an open source document that I hope will be used far and wide in a multi-layered research interventions covering EDI, anti-racism policy, museums best practice, research best practice with marginalised people. So just to finish, how this data currently fits into the current understanding of GRTSB crafts. This report, in combination with the red list, will be the non-romanticized version of the contemporary reality of GRTSB crafts practitioners as a living organic lineage of craft. I'd like to note that in the red list entries, we see that the three entries together, canal art, fairground art and Vardo making, form a picture of the mid-Victorian period all the way through to today, bridging the industrial revolution, economic changes, post-war urbanization and deeper political issues. And it is really fascinating, timely, and I hope empowering to everybody involved. So some further spaces of research are addressing areas of positive cultural growth, areas in need of practical support, areas in need of further research from grassroots researchers all the way through to academia, areas of EDI in museums, membership organisations and funding provision, and bursaries for independent GRTSB craftspeople to be supported in their training. So I'm going to end it here. I'm happy to take questions and discuss any preliminary findings. And the current good press is out there. Crafts Magazine, obviously Heritage Crafts and Traveller's Times are really amplifying this work. So I'll stop screen sharing now and thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Imogen. I'm so sorry I interrupted you with the pressing record whilst you were already underway. And I forgot to warn everyone that we were, with Imogen's kind agreement, we've recorded this session so we can share around the network. I'm fascinated by this work, and I just want to leap in and ask a question about I added some stuff in the chat about it, which I've been looking at online whilst you were chatting, but the exhibition in Brighton in 2021, were you involved in that, or was that connected in any way to the work that you've been doing?
So I was involved in that, but it was very much an 11th hour afterthought, which isn't a criticism, but it's a kind of symbol or sign of how organisations can miss people from. So I'm based in Brighton. I'm a craftswoman in Brighton, and Friends, Family and Travellers is a Brighton-based advocacy group. They're a charity. I think they're mostly run by settled people, but there are some GRTSB people on the staff. And they focus a lot on advocacy and representation for roadside families. And I heard, oh, they're having this big craft exhibition at the Phoenix, which was actually at the time next to my house. And I hadn't heard about it. I hadn't been contacted about it. So I just said, is there any space for me to put any of my work? And they were like, oh, yeah. So it was almost like there's a list of people who are identified as GRTSB craftspeople. And then there are people that are GRTS craftspeople who are not necessarily on anybody's list. So this was a few years ago now. And I was included, and it was really important for me because I got to meet other GRTSB craftspeople for the first time. Because I'll make the point that a lot of us are in isolation, working in isolation. If you've been assimilated or your family don't live traditionally, it can be a rare occurrence where you're actually in an exhibition space with your contemporaries. So that happened, and from that place I sort of realized that we were being underrepresented from the inside out, not necessarily from a charity asking us for, FFT, did a great job. And they also have a theatre production called Crystal's Vardo, which tours schools. And in the years since, I've actually created a piece of textile for Crystal's Vardo. So there's a collaborative relationship there now. But yeah, that was a really important moment for me to understand how GRTSV crafts are maybe pinned in certain sectors.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting and critical importance, I think, to people working in museums and trying to address questions of EDI in relation to collections development, for example. I've noticed for a long time, and this goes back way beyond my involvement in museums, but right back to the beginning of institutions like the Merle, and even earlier than that, that the same craftspeople get represented over and over again. They become the sort of go-to person. Often that's based in a kind of last in the line kind of model of ways of thinking about craft and practitioners. But I think that problem becomes extra complicated when you're looking at communities who are often excluded in other ways as well. So you get these layers of complexity about who's represented and who isn't. And I think that's a really critical issue. I guess it's one that Mary is very aware of in terms of the work she's doing at Heritage Crafts. And I'm assuming, Mary, you were involved in Imogen's work on this as well for the Red List. And
yes, it's very much a collaborative project, but we've been very pleased to be led by Imogen and the Traveller Times and the GLT community on this work. So it's been a really positive development for us. And yes, you're quite right. It's important that we don't always just represent the same people, and there's always a tendency as well to focus on that sort of romanticized, last in the line type vision of a rural idyll of heritage crafts, and actually that isn't the contemporary reality for any craftspeople really, or maybe a few, but yeah, we want that contemporary representation.
So messages here for us are twofold, I guess: reaching out to source and originating communities and working with contemporary communities, but also trying to avoid slipping into those kind of nostalgic tropes in the work that we do. Yeah. Is there anyone else who has questions or comments or thoughts or things they want to ask Imogen? These are normally much more informal, these sessions. I think maybe my technical incompetence has driven everyone into silence. George hasn't said anything.
I'm just looking in the chat. Someone, Sarah, has said, what role do you think fairs might play in this? And I'm going to make an assumption. Are you talking about traditional horse fairs like Stowe and Appleby and Epsom, or are you thinking about craft fairs that are like Bovey Tracy and those kind of places?
I'm thinking about everything really. I'm thinking about the role of more itinerant places of exchanges of knowledge and interactions with the public. I helped to run a fair, quite a new fair in Norfolk called Strumpshaw. We call it a tree fair, and it's basically a disguised gypsy fair, if you like, in that there is a high percentage of gypsies and travellers come, but we don't flag it up as a gypsy fair. It's just a place to do with celebrating people who work and make a living out of the countryside. Focus quite heavily on wood, but we do have wagon painters, and we have showmen who come, and it's a very, very broad brush kind of fair. But it seems to me that informality is a way of allowing things under the radar is really important with the community as a whole, not sort of focusing too much on labels and so forth. And I wondered whether you saw fairs like that as having a role in supporting endangered crafts. I mean, that's exactly the kind of people who come to our fair, who have stores, but also the people, the public who come interested in them. But we don't flag it up in that way. The idea is very much about, more of the marketplace, I suppose, where people can stroll around. I mean, we have got plans to have talks, and we have poetry and music and dancing and so forth. But it strikes me that could potentially be a really good platform for flagging up the Red List more in a more sort of direct way. And
Sarah,
I'm
could you
looking
just
forward to
repeat?
that.
Could you just repeat the name of the fair, please? I didn't quite catch
I'll
it.
write it into the chat.
Okay.
It's called Strumpshaw. It's held in the grounds of Strumpshaw Hall, where there is a steam museum. So there's always been a sort of little museum having steam rallies. And it's this year, it's July the 15th and 16th. So it's not far from Norwich. There is a Facebook page and a website if anyone's interested. But like I said, it's run by a family, a traveller family. But you know, the people who come are a mixture of Romany and Showmen and Irish travellers. And this, I think, is the 7th year.
Okay. Oh, that's great. Well, I mean, yeah, that's really insightful. So I'll sort of speak to that from the other side. So last Sunday I went to Romany Day, which was held at the Living Life Rural Museum. I'm sorry if I've got that in the wrong order, near Farnham. And it was a Romany centered meeting for the day, where other people, you know, settled people in the community were invited in. It was ticketed, it was safe, it was a safe space. It was promoted as Romany Day because Dee Cooper, who runs it, she really is about positive representation, because there's 2 layers to being Romany. Is if you're out about it, then you potentially have to take heat about that racially or politically or whatever. So there is an element of safety, and then there's also sort of self-identification or self-representation. So it sounds to me like the idea of going under the radar and establishing a fair that is a safe space, that is run by GRTSB people, and that does invite other people in, does a lot for community engagement. However, there is that moment of, but if we're having to invisibilize ourselves, because if it was advertised as a GRTSB fair, the police would get involved and people wouldn't want it. And I think we're always aware of that in our own selves. If I represent myself as a gypsy, will I be rejected? Will the stereotype apply? And I think the Red List and Romany Day and the press around those things are, because it's positive, hopefully it forms a bridge. And at the same time, I completely understand why the fair wouldn't want to promote it as a Romany fair, but it's obvious that it's a traveller inclusive event. But I think what I want to say to the room is the comprehension of why it isn't being promoted as GRTSB outright, because of the reasons of racism and prejudice and persecution.
Well, sorry, just to interrupt, I don't want to speak for the organizer of the fair, who's a friend of mine, and an Irish traveller, Candy Sheridan. But although I wasn't part of the early stages of the fair. She thought long and hard about how to advertise and promote. So this is a constant sort of discussion that she's having. But we have found other ways of promoting it as a gypsy fair. We produced a podcast, for instance, which you can find on our website, in which Candy talks very openly about the background to setting up the fair, which was one of being marginalised at other fairs and steam rallies and so forth, and treated very badly and sort of relegated sort of to the back of things. So although I'd say she's trying in some ways to go under the radar, she's not trying to invisibilize herself at all. I mean, nothing could be further from the truth. And the idea of the police being involved is very, very far from what's likely to happen. This is a very, very sedate, peaceful, mellow event where more and more people want to have stalls and want to show their crafts and so forth. It's been a real success story. So I think it's probably not as black and white as that. It's not about invisibilizing, but it's about creating a space where the crafts, what people do, is uppermost. That's what the focus is, not on who we are, but on what we do and what we have in common and how we work together with other artisans in the Norfolk countryside. It's very much focused on those traditional lifestyles and how close they were to each other. And I can honestly say there are lots of people who come to the fair and have no idea that it's being run by a family of Irish travellers. Absolutely no idea. I mean, if they wanted to think about it and ask questions, they would find out without any difficulty. But that is not uppermost. We do have a big section of bardos by the entrance, and we have more and more kind of events to do with gypsies and travellers, music and poetry and so forth. But we definitely want to expand on the GRT, the craftspeople, definitely, because the older generation are dying, and that's going to be really sad not to be able to include them.
There's quite a tradition in East Anglia of the fairs. Actually,
Yes.
I'm sure. Go back to Barsham back in the 70s, even earlier.
Yes, it's very much following the tradition of the Albion fairs, the old Albion fair. That was the desire, to kind of resurrect them or to keep them alive. I won't talk anymore, because I think that the key thing is I wanted to just put it out there that there are things happening outside traditional museum models. And I work in the heritage industry, so I'm aware of what's going on, or has been going on, for Gypsy Traveller History Month for some time. And yeah, Strumpshire Fair sits outside that traditional museum model, if you like.
That sounds great, Sarah. Thank you. I'm going to look that up.
I hope you come.
Yeah, I'll make it.
I'd love to introduce you to Candy as well.
It makes another good point about us feeling, we get a bit stuck in our sector, and we do things within museums, and we often don't retreat as far outside museums as we should, expecting people to come to us. But actually, there are contexts and conversations where it's far better for us to be going to other people and getting out there and getting out and about. Mary, I think you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point that I think it's been a really interesting process for us at Heritage Crafts. One, because several reasons. One, because we found out that lots of our members are GRT but had not identified themselves to us, and also obviously had not felt safe enough to do that before. So that was quite an interesting finding. We were quite shocked at some of the racism and violent language that was used in the process of doing some of the research as well, which is a real eye-opener, because it's quite easy from an outsider's point of view to say, well, that'll be nice, we'll include some traveller crafts, isn't that a nice thing? And actually hadn't possibly appreciated the risks that people like Imogen have to. I mean, she has to actively put herself in quite a risky situation in order to do this work, and it's exhausting to be that advocate sometimes. So it's personally takes quite a significant toll on people to engage with us on this work. So I just wanted to make the point really that it's quite it remains contested space, and that we have to do our best to hold that space whilst not trying to make any assumptions about how people want to respond or engage with us on it.
Thanks, Mary. Yeah, I made the point. I mean, I do feel a little bit emotional. Thanks for saying that. It's really hard work, guys. When you're a marginalised person who is like, well, I speak for myself. I'm the first person to go to higher education, and then to be the age that I am and the career that I've got, I'm relatively safe, whatever that means, and I can advocate. But I'm not the rule. Like, a lot of people live day to day at risk of real persecution, and with the policing bill, just living your life. And I made the point in the meeting the other day that I just would quite like to just make my work. And be proud of who I am and not have to hide who I am. And then hopefully that will then advocate for other people of all generations, but especially the youth, that they don't have to segregate their identity because they're white passing, right? So I'm Romany Gypsy. I'm from the Indian diaspora of the nomadic gypsies, and I white pass. So if I didn't say that I was a gypsy, people wouldn't know. That's my white privilege. But there are other Roma people and Romany Chal, British Romany people, who are much darker, and it's much less easy for them to pass. And when they're raised traditionally, there's a whole ethnic identity that gets attached to that, and that is politicized and racialized. So there's an idea that when you're in a position of privilege within a marginalized community, you advocate really hard for everybody so that they don't have to struggle. And at the same time, you know, bridging different spaces. I'm assimilated. I have family that are still traditional. I have to code switch. That's a mechanism. That's not something that I knew about that I did, but I do, because that's part of my passing in this world, is to be safe. I may have to code switch in a different way. And the Black community are much more able to speak into code switching. So it's all very nuanced, and how you present yourself as an integrated ethnic person is more holistic than a segregated, assimilated ethnic person who, I can be a craftsperson, but I can't also be a gypsy. That's a real wounded space, and I would really hope that the advocacy work and the red list and being able to see ourselves in a positive way and to be included is this sort of new wave of like crafts inclusion. So yeah, thanks for flagging that, Mary. I really appreciate your support.
I think some of this comes back to the challenges that museums set up in the way they do things, doesn't it? That the categorization of things, it's very hard for museums in the systems that they have to cope with complexity and intersectionality, and you know the multi-layered nature of people, that you know you can be more than one thing in lots of ways, and I think, you know, we set ourselves up to fail in a museum-based way. I think society more broadly has those challenges to face as well. But George, you've got your hand up again.
Yeah, I was just apologizing to you, Ollie, for not speaking.
I knew you would, but you know, I was just trying to encourage. I thought I could encourage you out of the woods, and then everyone else would come rushing too.
I was actually perusing the red list, because for the last few years I've been commissioned by ABC Clio. Fortunately, then haven't got onto my back. I'm writing a book on endangered intangible heritage worldwide, following the UNESCO list, which is quite a
bold undertaking, George.
Yes. And I have included canal art within this in the section, and as a few, I can't remember what I have included, but I don't think the British government has signed up to UNESCO intangible heritage safeguarding stuff even now, have they? I can't.
No.
I don't think I have.
No, we're just doing it anyway, George.
Oh yeah. I mean, I am sort of keeping my eyes on the UK situation, but I mean, there's a lot all over the world. I mean, let's be honest, there's some intangible heritages that you don't really want to. You'd rather they would disappear, like FGM and things like that. Yeah, so I was just looking through the red list, and I must admit, while I was looking through it, I did get sort of waylaid into looking at something else in the list. So that's why I was quiet, Ollie.
I have some updates on the canal art listing if you're interested, George, because one of the primary benefits of the way the red list works is that it's iterative. So when the data goes out there, then we inevitably get responses, people who tell us we got things wrong, or they're not on the list, or they are on the list, they don't want to be on the list, that kind of thing. So so we have had some responses to the canal art in a really positive way, but so there's some updates to provide on that as well, and it does mean that there's more each time we publish the data, more voices can be represented in that in that research.
I was interested to see the fairground art is also on the list, which sort of surprised me a little bit, but then
Can I ask
again,
why it surprised you, George?
because of the relative health of fairs going around, but then again, there was a fair recently in Stowe Market where I live, and I noticed that the art hadn't been updated in the way that it traditionally would be. As you know, traditionally you've got a lot of fairground art mirrored popular culture. So, you know, there's some rides, some of these big rides, which have images of people like Tina Turner and sort of images, and these haven't been updated in the way that they would have been possibly in days past.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a process, and we've I suppose the fairground art does primarily focus on the more traditional hand-painted elements that we might associate with the Carter's Steam Fair type aesthetic. However, we do include airbrushing and that art up into the 1960s, 70s, where that is also now becoming a bit of an endangered skill as it gets replaced by vinyl. And that is and those computer graphics and vinyl are obviously very important outsider art folk in their own right, but they're limiting because people are working within a digital platform, and so those traditional forms and the way it would respond to a space, and like you said, the cultural influences around it could be under threat. And there's actually as far as we know, very few people working at what we would consider to be a skilled level in fairground art. And there's lots of appropriation as well. You know, a lot of people doing poor imitations of a fairgroundy kind of aesthetic, but who aren't embedded in fairgrounds and the showman community at all.
I think Fairground Heritage Trust down at Lifton they have contacts, I know.
Yeah, well, they helped us to write the listing. So
right, good. I did some work for them years ago, and one of the things that struck me, if you go down there, there's a ride with a huge, wonderful Ben-Hur rounding board picture from it's got a picture of Ben-Hur chariots and everything going around, but actually painted by a known person, Lacking, so I think and I think that ride was put into the transport in sort of 1930s, something like that, and stayed in that transport for many years until it was re-erected at the Fairground Heritage Trust. And that rounding board would not have survived in the way it is with that picture if it had been in continual use, because they would have overpainted it with some other cultural reference, because sort of Ben-Hur was referring to the Ben-Hur film that came out at the time and was well known, you know. So, but anyway, that's a bit of a tangent. So
yeah, it's all really fascinating though, because and it's very nuanced as well, because not all people working in particularly in boat painting and canal art would have been from traveller community, from boater communities anyway, and people making vardos and that and wheelwrights and all those people that supported those crafts would have been trusted allies of the GRT community rather than within the communities. So it's quite a rich area of research and discussion to kind of unpick and pick that stuff. I mean, maybe we never will, and that's fine. I think it's important to acknowledge that, you know, you're probably never going to be able to fully understand all the complexities and nuances within these communities.
Yeah, there are some other parallels there, I guess. Again, I keep coming back to museums and the disastrous model of museum practice, but the museums do have a tendency to kill culture. We acquire stuff and then it fixes it in time and it becomes the canon against which other things are reflected. And this is true. I hate to say it, it's true even of active heritage crafts and really successful and not so endangered ones, particularly like basket making, where basket makers come back to reference collections like the Merle and they will remake and remake in the same mold as generations before. And some of that is tradition, but some of it is just replicating because it's canon, and it's not necessarily as vibrant and alive living culture as it would be if it wasn't sort of preserved in aspect by museum practice. But Robin, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to reflect something back to Imogen. I'm doing I've got a role at the moment as social practice lead at a heritage centre in the New Forest, and I've been brought in specifically to engage with a couple of different groups. And there's something you just said that so struck me about, there's two things that I want to say to you, which is about, God, listen to me. Like my voice is saying it to you because I feel it so strongly about what you just said. There's something about bids that are written and the timescale of expectations on institutional interrelationships between Gypsy, Roma, traveller, showman, boaters, and trust. And actually, that bid probably should have been written over a 20-year period, let alone an 18-month period. There's something so strong in terms of what it is you're talking about cementing these relationships and how you even begin to rebuild that sense of trust between an institution and, say, a particular item. So I'm working with a particular item that has one representation from 1979. And the bid is all surrounding how we bring in all of the other, not alternative, I'm really passionate about this, parallel, pre-existing versions of this version. Parallel, not alternative. It's not given an alternative. This is all happening in a parallel world. It's just, it wasn't being viewed from that lens. And I just wanted to reflect that back to you. It was so strong what you just said about building trust and whether or not we can even hit those markers in funding bids that are 18-month funding bids that could be 50-year funding bids or intergenerationally in terms of trauma. Yeah.
Thanks, Robin. That's really heartening to hear how you received that. So this is the thing, post-war Romany families, so I'm only one generation post-war. My parents are quite elderly. So I'm sort of I've missed a generation almost. So my mum and dad are war babies. And so listen, I'm just going to lay it out for you how this is Romany specific, and my dad's Irish, so maybe some Irish adjacent, but Midlands traveller people. This is how our life has been post-war, and as a daughter of those people, how I am communicating you today comes from this. So post-Second World War, a lot of Romany families and traveller families were offered council social housing for the first time to get them off the road post-war. So my family were relocated from Bristol to Wolverhampton. The entire extended family were put into social housing, and they were very grateful to do that. However, they then had to assimilate into the working class community of Wolverhampton, completely deny their Roma heritage, and blend in to get by. Can you imagine that level of cultural severance and trauma?
Oh, Imogen, I'm only interrupting you very, very briefly to say to you that one of the objects that we're working with at the Heritage Centre, which I'm so astounded by and appalled by, is an ordnance survey map that says Gypsy Rehabilitation Centre.
Yeah. Yeah,
I could work for the next 20 years on that map alone, let alone everything else. That map alone, that's dissertations, isn't it? That's everything. That's
wow. Yeah, my emotion is here. That's heavy lifting, Robin. Bloody hell. So when you think about me in front of you now, I'm 40 years old. and I'm just claiming my heritage publicly. When you hear that, right, this was happening in England. My family knows it because they decided to not be Gypsy anymore. But you can't not be your culture. It doesn't work like that. Okay, there's a family culture and names, and people know who you are ultimately. So you've got to carry around not only a split identity, you've been moved or relocated or rehabilitated. I mean, let that chill pass through your body, because my mom has lived with that trauma of knowing she can't be that. And as her daughter, I have to say to her, but it's okay that I'm that now, because 80 years has passed. But is it really? And the people that you're working with, and the people, and I say this in kindness, but knowing that you'll hear me, people that you want to contribute to your project or research or work with are dealing with this weight of hidden trauma before they've even decided to claim it or make art, make beauty from it. And we are living in this every day. It doesn't heal, because you may be dealing with an elder in your immediate home that is still traumatized. There's lateral violence, you know, there's alcoholism, and all these things are products of trauma. And I think the best way we can reflect about the care that the Roma community, I'm speaking as a Roma person, but the traveller communities need, is when we look at the indigenous communities of the Americas, and we look at how they are trying to keep their identity against all odds and against, really, you know, it's genocide. The traveller community know about genocide. It's just not talked about. So it's, you know, we have our families who were in Europe being murdered. So when we, and I say this with all gravitas and weight that I can bring, when we say we'd like a nice exhibition of Vardos, yes, that's beautiful and lovely, and to get the people that really need to receive it, they need to receive their identity back to them. There's a lot of care that's needed, because we're talking about cultural trauma, and it doesn't end. You know, we've had the policing bill, which is recent, but the political will and the media combined really, really make it hard to live as a Romani person and be proud of oneself. Not because we're not proud of ourselves, but because we're not allowed to be. So I'll just say that, but thank you for sharing that, Robin. That's
thank you for your knowledge. Yeah, you know.
Can I ask a question? And this is a big question, and probably not one that's easy to answer. If there was one thing that museums, as they currently stand, could be doing to better address some of the challenges that you're talking about in terms of both extractive behavior, but also representation, helping to be allies in addressing ongoing trauma, and the legacies of the kinds of things that you're talking about, what would that thing be? What's the most critical, you know, the most urgent and important step right now? I mean, you know, it's clear that these things are ongoing and society has not moved on, and you know, there are big significant challenges out there politically and socially, but museums can do something. What is it?
Yeah, well, Ollie, that's a really great question, and I have got a remedy. So it is the conversation. It is really oral histories, storytelling, recording people's experiences of their own lives. And the elders really want to chat with you. Okay, I'll just put it out there. Romani people want to have a chat. They want to talk to you about their heritage, and but it's the trust there. So there needs to be a safe space created where there's a relationship. There might be a designated person that is introduced to a Romani person, an elder, and then they just sit and have a cup of tea and have a chat. And from that genuine, authentic relationship, you'll discover quite quickly what would be nice is, you know, to see ourselves represented, but also that we somehow guide the conversation. That an elder might have a really, I mean, I speak for my own family, natural storytellers. One point of focus, like an item, saying, you know, we have this item, not that it's like please tell us all about the history from a data analysis. It might be, spend some time with this item, and does it trigger any stories for you? Like, be therapeutic about it, mindful. And once a Roma elder starts to speak, they'll be bringing in a lot of wisdom that is this intangible cultural heritage, exactly. And from what they give you, the gift of their story, then you can start to think about what might support. But there has to be a conversation, and it's not a digital space. It's a relational, human to human space.
I think there are challenges that raises in terms of recording, doesn't it? And again, appropriation or the holding of knowledge. So again, I was thinking again about my failure to announce at the beginning of the session rather terribly that we were going to record it. We had spoken to Imogen in advance about that, and that was fine. I was then slightly struck when you started sharing images that you had been given permission to use in particular contexts, and it becomes quite multi-layered, you know, the permissions around those things. I was also, I noticed someone I follow on Twitter who's going to the GRT space at Glastonbury and is going to be speaking there. He was pointing out that in that context, he was happy to share stories about family histories because he knew explicitly it wasn't being recorded. So there are contexts in which people feel comfortable, and museums are often not that context because there's, you know, we're hidebound to sort of extracting stuff and making it part of collections. And there's a value to that, I think, for the communities in question moving forward, but it's about knowing that they're playing a part in that. So some of what Robin was saying, I think, is really critical there, that the challenges about building that trust over a very long period of time, and some of the museums represented within the Rural Museums Network have been working in these spaces for a long time. Others have not. So I think we all need to be helping each other as well in terms of a network and supporting each other to do this better.
That's the natural outcome of real relationships. So I'm gonna offer an insight. The first conversation that you have with a Romani person shouldn't be about data collection, recording, cataloging, no taking notes. It should just be a conversation, because you know what? Our humanity is almost like not really implicit anymore. We're almost this like mythologized, you know, other fairy version of ourselves, and we're not. We're just humans. And we have a way of communicating that is very archaic and wonderful and nomadic. And I think that when we've been through academia and we have methodology and structures of gathering information, because that's the valuable thing. Yes, information is valuable, but the most valuable thing is the human to human interface and that first meeting. Because the Romani elder is going to want to know as much about you as you want to know about them. It's not an extractive, transactional conversation. It's a human, genuine conversation, and I would welcome and invite people to think about that. And then, if there's something that you want from that person, the marginalized person, be clear about that. Saying, you know, I really, what you said when we had our chat last month, this really struck me. Can I talk to you about that a little bit more? And would you mind if I recorded that part of that conversation, and you get to listen to it back and you get to edit it? Anything I type, you get to edit it. Or that this is the level of trust building that it's like, it's not the thing that's being protected. I think that people realize it's not that Roma people don't want you to have the information. It's that they're really here to be present with you. That's how we live. We have an itinerant culture, and it's day to day, and it's moment to moment, and it's person to person, and we're very good at that. And I think the digital world and the world of research and academia and data collection isn't really in alignment with that initial moment of meeting and greeting, where you find out everything about that person and you welcome them into your space, whether that's a psychological space or a physical space. Does that make sense? I know that's quite a lot, and that's maybe quite nuanced and maybe a bit challenging, but I think that's the only way to progress with authentic relationship. And then the data collection is almost secondary.
That makes absolute sense to me. I like the fact that it starts with a simple cup of tea and a conversation. I think that's a really nice starting point, and probably a really nice end point. I don't know whether anyone has any final comments or questions or thoughts, but we're sort of reaching 10 minutes over the hour, having started 10 minutes late, and it seems like that's a really good point to end on if everyone's happy with that. Imogen, thank you so much. That's been really amazingly useful for me, and I'm sure everyone else would agree. And Daniel's just sharing that he's apologizing he hasn't had his camera on because he's on holiday. I think he's allowed to be on holiday once in a while, Daniel, not too often. But thank you for joining us from your holiday, Daniel, and thank you to everyone for coming along. That's been really amazing. Yeah, we'll try and share this around the network as usual. And I'm sorry I missed the beginning in terms of the recording. I will be watching it back over again now.
You're forgiven.
Thanks for having me. I'll send the slides as a resource and the links as well. Thanks everyone. Thanks for listening. Thanks for your feedback.